I'll explain in a sec. So the story of the body is set in a school in the near future of a sort of dystopian world, and Mr. Smith, the teacher, is kind of ending his school day. Body. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. They found another body in the trees, Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith ignored it. They were always on the new skin feed these days. Even when they were supposed to be working, they had a way of fooling the eyes. They'd become little masters of the art. And who wouldn't when 1,000 red words earned you a credit? Even if you had to spend it on brand, of course. Schools, never able to compete, had already begun speed reading courses, casting aside the dead wood of literature and music. Few chose to learn about stuff the machines could make now. It's behind the tech blocks, sir, like the other ones were. Through a window streaked with the apostrophes and scrawled lines of rain, Mr. Smith watched a procession of greys ghost across the sky. Summer's lease, he remembered. The earth would be swollen later, oozing mud from its pores, worms writhing in the ecstasy of soil, decomposing life, undoing its music. He thought of the body lying there, exposed to the rain, just a sad, lifeless thing slung away, forgotten. And then he pictured the patch of grass pressed flat, blades bent, waiting to unfold again, a lighter green being sheltered and ready to forget its heavy burden. No one else was bothered by the bodies. It was simply a curious distraction for the students and a logistics situation for the management who had to arrange the disposal. They'd begun to appear almost weekly now, but being so swiftly dealt with, Mr. Smith had begun to wonder if they were as they seemed. It wasn't ordinary, and, as dead as they may be, some dignity ought to be given to them. Mr. Smith clenched a tight fist to hold on to the thoughts that threatened to spill out. Once he'd composed the complaint to the head, they'd wisely mem-wiped before getting to school that morning. He wrote it in his journal instead, the secret book he kept in his jacket lining. In this great age of openness, one always kept their thoughts close to their chest. A hidden heart was a safe heart, went the old adage. The thought of that body just lying there haunted him during the day. He kept imagining a cool blue limb slumped under a desk, or else two stiff legs, slightly bruised, protruding from beneath a cupboard. As he turned towards the board, he was certain that he'd seen a blank-eyed, pale body curled in the corner of the room, staring. As he tried to concentrate on his writing on the board, he could feel the body slowly moving closer to him, dragging itself softly upright, though still hanging from its own frame. Each footstep a soft, naked slap of the soul as it crept towards him. He could feel a cold presence, as though it was so close behind him it might, at any moment, press stiffened lips against the nape of his neck, as a slight breath traced about his ear. Unsure whether it might be a kiss or bite, Mr. Smith had spun around and swiftly tried to explain how the rainbow itself is now given in the dull catalogue of common things, hoping to dispel that chill he'd felt by flinging an old poetic chant into the room. The students seemed not to hear at all. Mr. Smith hid a trembling hand in his pocket, lest the eyes notice. After school, Mr. Smith took a different path through the campus than usual. He turned left towards a tech block. The rain-soaked pavements glistened in an afternoon light that set the edges of things alight. He played with words that just murmured on his lips, trying to recompose the scene to later write a few lines about the eerie stillness. He deliberately delayed leaving so as to be one of the last as he pulled his jacket around him. The tech block was a cold steel edifice with struts like ribs and mirrored window glass. It loomed like some half-risen machine blindly pushing itself out of the mud or trying not to sink back into it. Skirting its sprawled architecture, he squeezed through the densely planted ornamental tree line and onto the thin strip of derelict land that separated the school from the roadway, which hummed and sparked intermittently like a live wire spitting vehicles homeward. He'd found one of the bodies once before, thrust half out of the tree line, stiff and cold, assuming it to be a dumped joy maiden at first, and curious, he'd got too close. There were still beads of dew on its face, and its fingers seemed to curl as if clutching an apple. Its eyelids flickered as it lay, otherwise it was still as stone. Its battery core had yet to quite die. A wave of pity for this thing had oddly engulfed him. It was a different model, an older one, designed for menial chores, designed to diminish loneliness, as they all were, but not like the joy maidens did. This one would have retold personal stories from whichever past you programmed it with. He quickly looked away, almost shamefully, as if he'd seen what he should not. He glimpsed in its eye that unmistakable feeling of being trapped. The dew on its cheek gave the impression of its having been weeping, caught mid-tear by his clumsy intrusion. Mr. Smith sometimes imagined he'd be found in the trees, one morning just discovered, recovered and recycled. He imagined lying there, naked and alone, eyes only mirrors now, and limbs no longer clenched in fear. A strange weight, awkwardly posed to make it seem as if he'd only fallen. He imagined the men who'd come along, busily lifting his loose limbs, casually throwing him into the back of a truck without noticing the residual warmth of his flesh. He could almost feel their bruising fingers on his bones, clutching and squeezing. And he imagined the way his body might be flung into one of the caves to be stripped and undone, with the last dregs drained. Cold comfort indeed to imagine his temple in ruins, his eyes rolled away and hands untouched. His body left to slowly rot, collapsing into an obscure and insignificant moment in history. Now under trees that dripped autumn fire, Mr. Smith could just make out a shade amongst the deepening shadows. Away from the hard paths, his shoes sank a little in the muddy grass. From this nearing distance, limbs began to form out of the darkness, slithers of a self abandoned. He pushed his fists further into the resisting corners of his pockets, as if trying to find a solid truth in a world of mud and dark and uncertainty. And there it lay. He slowly knelt, an aching pain in his hip reminding him of the life that had worn him out so far. Easing himself down, he settled into the filth autumn leaves behind as it undresses its gold to become ghost. Chill had begun to gather itself, and a fine mizzle dampened branches darkly. The pale naked skin seemed to glisten in the evening sun's last low look. For a while Mr. Smith just sat still, heart full of fear, hands now firmly clasped in each other. And yet a wave was building, driven by a deep down urge to connect, to touch that which he should not, a body. The word itself was too immense to contemplate, to have all that power whilst it lay there, vibrating a translucent sheen of oils and the two open as they slowly reached towards the arm of the body, its wrist upturned, hinting that a pulse might be felt. His fingertips hovered within moments of contact. Sparks burst from his blood, flowing over the void and electrifying the flesh below. His heart leapt, beat wild tattoos, and flung itself about its cage, and reaching inexorably closer to the skin, Mr. Smith's hand began to tremble, as if caressed by an uncertain lover. Breath held, he tenderly touched the flesh, which acquiesced to the soft press of his fingers. It felt cool and heavy, a dead weight lying beneath the surface. In a moment of madness, as if drawn by a magnet, he lowered his face towards the slightly parted lips that seemed to whisper to him. The kiss was so delicate, so gently caught in time's gossamer web. A flaming desire to be touched and to touch overwhelmed him. He thought of all the beauty and the death, the great wars, and the private griefs in the world. He gazed along the curves that swooped down the arm. The fingers on one hand had somehow slightly dug themselves into the earth, just enough to leave dirt traces loosely clinging to the cuticles. It was such a small touch, a tentative rooting into a soil that little cared for the intrusion. He stared at those fingers, arching in a last desperate attempt to feel something in this world. A twitch, a sudden thought flashed in his mind. This body had no regulation code on its wrists. It was not synthetic. Dread, with cold, intrusive roots, began to wind about his spine. He'd done what he should not. He'd ruined the sanctity of the place. He wept as he thought in dead words. Noli me tangere. Thank you.